What's going on, fellas? Doing another quick video following this wave slash trend I have going on of simple videos that are just easy shit that you can try within your own program. Doesn't have to be this big philosophical framework that I give you that you have to then interpret how that might look as a program itself. It's just, here is something that I like to do. Try it yourself, see how it works. And what I would like to share with you today is going to be just some exercise pairings that I really like. Now, what do I mean by exercise pairings? In the past, I've talked about my love for micro workouts. So basically just the bodybuilding work we do at the end of our total strength session where we're looking to hypertrophy the relevant muscles, right? So we finish up an overhead press workout, we have shoulders and triceps. A little micro workout, very effective pairing of a couple of exercises to grow those muscles. Maybe we finish up a squat workout. We have quads, glutes, and adductors. We finish up a deadlift workout. We have hamstrings and back, right? And I've talked about micro workouts that I throw at the end that I feel are quick but very effective hypertrophy workouts that we can do. It's not what I'm talking about today when I say exercise pairings. I mentioned in that video how I like things where you train a muscle in a shortened position, then a lengthened position. So a hamstring curl, and then an RDL or a leg extension, and then a squat or a split squat. And that's a pairing I like, but we're going to talk about more of the meat and potatoes, big motions that I like to pair alongside those. So if we kind of break down our program into the first thing we're doing in a day is going to be our primary exercise. This is the exercise where we are most concerned with our numbers, our strength, right? It's kind of be what we're using to measure our strength. So whether that be a low bar squat, a high bar squat, a front squat, whether that be, let's see, your bench press, your overhead press, your deadlift, right? So these are the main lifts where we're concerned with, let's say, our 1RM as a proxy for strength. Or maybe you don't like working up to singles, but you use a 3RM or a 5RM as your measurement to make sure you're getting stronger. That is going to be your primary lift. We're going to skip ahead to our third or our tertiary motion slot, which is going to be exactly what we talked about earlier. It's going to be our accessories. It's usually going to be those more bodybuilding, lower scale motions with the focus of hypertrophying the muscles that are relevant to our primary lift for that day. So as always, it's a drum that I will beat till the end of time. We want to make sure that we're doing enough of our primary lift to where if that was all we did, we would get better at it, right? So we want to do enough sets of squats where realistically that's enough to drive progress. We could leave the gym and come back and be slightly better next week than we were this week, rather than doing the bare minimum on the primary lift and relying on secondary and tertiary lift volume to drive a forward response where there wouldn't otherwise be one. I think that if you use that minimum effective amount and then it's not even the minimum effective amount, because if we did that alone, it wouldn't be enough. If we used our secondary and tertiary stuff to kind of bolster not enough of the primary, we're missing out on a lot of the practice we should be getting on the primary. So instead of doing one all-out set of squats and then a million different exercises to make sure that we're moving forward, I would rather have you do a couple more sets of squats so we get a good strength response, but also get more skill because strength is a skill, and then do a little bit less of the accessories, right? Higher specificity training, so to speak. So we have this idea of, okay, so we want to make sure we're doing enough of this primary lift to move forward. And then with whatever energy we have left and whatever recovery capacity we have left, we want to have these little bodybuilding workouts to make sure that we're continuing to hypertrophy the relevant muscles year round, right? So obviously we'll have hypertrophy phases on that primary lift where we're going to be doing rep ranges that are conducive to hypertrophy on that main lift, and that's going to be improving your hypertrophy through that phase. But maybe when we move into a strength phase or a peaking phase, that primary slot is not going to be driving very much hypertrophy. And because the biggest difference between you and someone stronger than you most of the time is the size of the relevant muscles, there's no reason we shouldn't be growing our relevant primary movers for most of the year. Sure, when we get really close to a meet, we need to decay some fatigue. We might drop that off because hypertrophy, we're not going to get much strong. We're not going to get much bigger in that final 3-4 weeks before a meet. But for most of the year, especially for guys who are beginner or intermediate, but even advanced guys, we should have some constant year-round hypertrophy stimulus. And that's going to be those tertiary lifts. So what goes in the middle here? What are we defining as secondary lifts? And we're going to define those secondary lifts as variations, specifically more often than not self-limiting variations of that primary lift. So a motion that's going to shift the muscular emphasis, it's going to shift the technical emphasis. So that could be changing the bar position for the squat. It could be using a specialty bar for the squat. It could be introducing a tempo or a pause to the squat. It could be using a different grip on the bench, a different tempo, a different pause duration. It could be something as far away as a floor press, a board press, fiddling with the range of motion, where they're all still bench presses in some form, but they're changed pretty significantly to skew our muscular emphases, right? We kind of get, okay, that's the secondary slot. Sam, you're telling me a bunch of shit I know. I know, I'm just laying the foundation because lots of people watch these videos at different levels, right? And central philosophy of mine is that when we're looking to select a secondary variation, we want to select something that hits what the primary variation missed, right? So if we're doing enough of the main lift to get better, we're kind of topping out certain muscular emphases. What we want to do with the secondary is not double down on that same stimulus, so it wouldn't be going from a low bar squat straight into good mornings, for example. We're already using the lower back and posterior chain quite a bit on our low bar squat. We're not just going to hammer this redundant stimulus for our variation. Instead, we want to use the secondary motions to fill in the gaps in our development that doing the primary motion alone might create. Now, the quintessential example of this that I think a lot of us can relate to, and it's just such a concrete example that I see fairly often, is if someone does a bunch of low bar squatting, they're doing enough low bar squatting frequently enough that their strength is going up and up on the low bar. They might find that their form tends to go even more good morning-esque on their squat, because when they do difficult reps on their low bar squats, they find that using their lower back rewards them. You build up the lower back more, and it's this spiraling pattern of building up the lower back more and more and more, and using a more hinge dominant pattern. Dan Green has talked about this a few times, where if he did nothing but low bar squats, he would have a very strong back and his quads would lag further and further behind. And that's where we want to use a secondary exercise to fill in the gaps of that technique. And this is where we're going to talk about the exercise pairings that I like. So if someone is squatting low bar, for example, we're using a lot of posterior chain, and maybe we're missing a little bit of quads. So for our secondary variation for a low bar squatter, usually what I like to see is either a high bar squat, a high bar pause squat. One of the things I like about the pause is the little bit of extra stress it places on the hips, where you're having to maintain that abducted bottom position a little bit more. So if I see someone in their low bar squat, maybe their quads and their hips are lagging behind, we might throw a pause on the high bar. So we can go high bar, pause, front squat, or front squat with a pause. All things to kind of skew that emphasis a little bit more towards the knee and a little bit less towards the hip. Otherwise, we'd be kind of redundant with the low bar squatting. And if we could do a redundant stimulus, we probably should have done more of that main thing or something close to it. And we're going to use that kind of fact that there are different fatigue profiles to let us fit in a little bit more squatting. So maybe, okay, well, I couldn't do any more low bar squats. I did some pause low bars and I did my regular low bars because my lower back is fried. But I could do a couple more sets of front squats, right? And that lets me fit in a little bit more squatting every week, and that's recover from it on a consistent basis, and that's going to allow me to get better. So those are my favorites for pairing with a low bar. I think if someone really needs work on their motor patterning and driving out of the hole with their hips rising at the same speed as the bar, favoring something like a front squat that limits your forward lean and kind of keeps you honest on maintaining an upright posture is good. If someone's a little bit more skillful lifter and they can have the ability to do a high bar squat without just turning that into a back exercise as well, then maybe we would opt to use a little bit more load, right? Because kind of one of the big benefits to the front squat is that you're going to be in this very upright position. It's going to heavily punish deviating from it. If we have a little bit more skilled lifter who can avoid that forward tilt either way, we may as well opt for a little bit of extra weight via more back squatting, right? So that was my top two would probably be for the lower bar squatter, either a pause high bar or a front squat. If a person is a high bar primary stance, right, this is where we could look to something like a good morning, right? Because we're not using our posterior chain quite as much. And this is where I really like throwing in SSB squats. If someone is a high bar primary squatter, oftentimes I like to make their secondary day an SSB because a high bar squat is going to be a little bit more taxing on the legs, maybe a little bit less taxing on the back. Something like a front squat that is trying to fold you up forward the whole time is going to increase the demands on that mid-back strength. And I think it works synergistically very well with the high bar. That being said, some people have a very well-balanced high bar squat, and if they just do high bars, their body tends to develop in good proportion to one another, in which case I would probably just select something like a pause squat just to take away the stretch reflex. And that's where we're looking for the variation, because usually people who are really good high bar squatters oftentimes use a bit of stretch reflex. So again, we're going to hit what we missed. We used a lot of stretch reflex on the top one. We're going to take that away and develop pure strength from the bottom via either a pause squat or a pin squat, right? So it doesn't always have to be shifting muscular emphasis. It can also be more philosophical. I don't know if philosophical is the word, but it could be a little bit more conceptual. Like, okay, well, I move very explosively on my primary lift. I want to do something where I move very slowly. Or it could be the other side of the coin. I move very slowly when I low bar squat. I would like to do something a little faster for my secondary to hit those things that I missed. Maybe if someone's a very slow squatter, something like maybe more of a speed work protocol might benefit them more. Or if someone's like fast or fails, finding a secondary variation that gets them a little bit more comfortable grinding, right? So that would be kind of my breakdown of squats, what I like high bar, what I like low bar. If someone benches with a closer grip, right? We bench with a closer grip. Usually what is happening is we're shifting a little bit of muscular emphasis towards the triceps and the shoulders, and maybe a little bit less demands on the chest. So what I like to see as a secondary motion a lot of the time is something that's going to place the pecs in a greater stretch position. So either a slightly wider grip variation. Maybe it is a chest press machine that lets someone safely, and they feel in a controlled manner, load a slightly more abducted position. And a lot of the time it's going to be dumbbells. Almost always my favorite variation for a guy who's a close grip bencher is going to be a good range of motion dumbbell work where we're able to stretch out the pecs a little bit more. Now, if someone is a wider grip bencher without a huge arch, we're relying a little bit more on the chest, maybe a little bit less on the triceps and shoulders. So simply bringing the grip in as a secondary variation, kind of reversing those muscular emphases, can be a very good option for them. Now, if you're someone who benches with a bit wider grip and a bit bigger arch, it doesn't have to be those crazy huge arches that you might see on the internet and everybody loves to complain about. But if you identify yourself as someone who's cutting a decent chunk of range of motion, again, we can go a little bit more conceptual rather than a little bit less muscular, like a little less direct in that way. So what are we hitting on the main lift? We're hitting a lot of weight with a little bit of reduced range of motion, right? So on our assistance motion, we want to go greater range of motion, maybe with a little bit less weight. And so if someone's got a wider grip and a decent arch, usually I'd like to see them do like a close grip feet up. So we reduce that arch, bring the grip in, and really emphasize the range of motion, because that's what's being missed on the primary lift. My two favorite exercises for people who do have a good arch and a good reduced ROM bench is going to be feet up close grip, and it's also going to be incline as another means of arch reduction. Basically, you can get into your normal arch-ish on the incline if that's just where you feel comfortable pressing, but because we're raising that touch point up our chest, our ability to reduce the range of motion goes away. So I really like incline for people who have that more, let's say reduced ROM bench. Now, if someone overhead presses with a closer grip, right? Again, we're probably going to be relying a little bit more on the triceps, maybe a little bit less on that opened up, like abducted shoulder strength. So someone like that, I might look to do a slightly wider grip behind the neck press, a slightly wider grip machine press, maybe in the Smith machine, maybe in some kind of good, maybe with dumbbells going out a little bit further, right? Because we're over relying on stacking into our triceps. This is where we have our power, because our triceps are strong and developed. We want to take away that strength a little bit and bias it towards the shoulder, or vice versa. If someone really likes to go wide because they're confident in their shoulder strength and they don't have as much confidence in their strength surrounding the elbow, something like a closer grip overhead press, a closer grip high incline press would probably be my favorite for that person. And just doing close grip bench press, I think, is also a very good supplemental motion. Another one I wanted to mention is if someone has a very chest dominant bench, they're going to be using a decent chunk of triceps, a big chunk of chest. The delts are less important. I do like to use a vertical press as a secondary motion to pick up what's missed there. Someone like Sebastian Oreb, who is a big arch, wider grip bencher, uses a lot of chest in his bench. will always include a vertical press because it's picking up what is missed by his main technique. And that brings us to deadlifts. So if we start with sumo, sumo's changing the leverages of a deadlift quite a bit. One of the things that we're decreasing the emphasis on is like a big range of motion hip hinge, right? So if someone's got a good sumo deadlift, I usually like to see them doing an RDL or a stiff leg deadlift somewhere in their program to increase the demands on their posterior chain, right? Because we're getting nice, let's say we're getting reasonably upright in our sumo. We have pretty high demands across our upper back still. Cool, awesome. We have a greater demands on our knee extensors, maybe greater demands on our adductors and abductors, but we have less demands kind of through that pure posterior chain, hamstring, glute, low back, right? So we're going to pick an exercise that, okay, our upper back got a good amount of work, our hips, so to speak, got a good amount of work, our knee extensors got a good amount of work. We're going to fill in that posterior chain gap by doing some RDLs or some stiff legs. That would be one I like. And then if you do feel as though your upper back is lagging within your sumo deadlift, doing a slightly wider stance snatch grip deadlift is one that a lot of people have had success with. Because it's a conventional deadlift on some capacity, we're having to get lower down to the bar. We're also going to fill in that gap of maybe lower back and hamstring strength that we might be missing from the reduced range of motion of a sumo deadlift. Now, conventional is highly varied. There's high level conventional deadlifters tend to have a wider array of effective techniques than highly effective sumo deadlifters. Most highly effective sumo deadlifters have kind of similar technique, and the differences usually come down to differences in their proportions, not necessarily differences in the technique they're using. Usually it's fairly similar, whereas in the conventional deadlift, we have some people who pull really big deadlifts from borderline extension. It's this super pretty flat back, really hamstring dominant pull. You have some guys who have really underdeveloped lower bodies who just do these round back pulls that are all in the spinal erector and upper back and are performing at extremely high levels. So I can't tell you that's a wrong technique. It's just going to skew what we're looking for out of an accessory, right? So if you are that round back deadlifter, maybe you got a little bit spindly legs, right? We know our spinal erectors are fried. That is not what we need to do more of once we finish deadlifting. Chances are your upper back is reasonably thrashed as well. That's not as important. Shifting emphasis towards your lower body with something like a strict RDL, where you force yourself to do something from a flat back position, create a greater length through the hamstrings, and grow that musculature, it might have this impact of making your main technique a little bit more well-rounded if you bring up these lagging areas. So if you're that round back deadlifter, I usually like to see a strict stiff leg, a strict RDL, and something like a front squat, again, where we're loading the ability to maintain a neutral position and shifting that emphasis towards the lower body. Now, on the other side of the coin, if you're just someone who your back is always flat, right, but you have no power off the floor, we might want to actually build up a little bit more strength in a rounded position. That's where something like I don't want to do like a full Rubish row. I think that relying on extreme, momentum through the top isn't exactly what we're looking for. If you look back at old videos of Ed Cohn doing rows, so the Ed Cohn style row that he broke down on Super Training, or more recently, some of the videos where Kaler does rows, the Kaler style rows, some of them are within a range of control that I like. Some of them are a little bit, ego lifty for big weights, but basically a deadlift row hybrid where we do have a little bit of hip hinging where we reach it to tap the ground, maybe just shy of the ground. We hinge a little bit, we come up, we row through, all under control, but we're building up a little bit of control of spinal extension, spinal flexion, right? So if you are this flat back deadlifter, maybe you're coming from like an Olympic lifting background, getting a little bit more comfortable with a slight round in your back, using something like this deadlift row hybrid to really develop your spinal erectors and mid back to be comfortable grinding a deadlift with a little bit of breakdown and bringing up the upper body side of a deadlift. So I think that the two most common classifications of people skewing further and further on the deadlift would be like the upper body, more dominant puller, who I really would just emphasize to them to do strict RDLs, single leg RDLs, hamstring curls, front squats, as a lot of their assistance work for their deadlift. And on the other side of the coin, we have someone who's, let's say, a little bit more lower body dominant. They need to have their back ramrod straight because they have no confidence in their the strength of their spinal erectors. We might want to do a lot of rowing, do a lot of deficit deadlifts, where we are getting a little bit more comfortable giving a bit of mid-back. Nothing crazy. You don't have to go do max effort Jefferson curls, but those would be my favorite. And then if you're just kind of a, par for the course. Oh, the other one more conceptually that I figured I would mention is speed pulls might be good for slower deadlifters. Probably not a good use of time if you're already an explosive lifter. If you do a good job getting your legs into your pull, a stiff leg would be a very logical, okay, we're doing a reasonably upright conventional deadlift when we do a good job. For our main lift, we want to do not so upright, really rely on that hip hinging, right? So if you're someone who gets their legs into their pull quite well, we might be looking to do stiff legs as our main secondary lift. And if you're someone who does a very bad job getting their legs into their pull, obviously we probably want to be doing some pause deadlifts to make sure we can keep that weight in our legs, but something like a front squat, something like a SSB box squat from your deadlift stance, something to really emphasize that leg component could be very valuable for you. So that would be my main tips. Thank you for watching.